Welcome to Authors Alcove. This is Agnes Wolf. Today I have Felice Hardy with me. She has written over 20 travel guidebooks, which she has co-authored with her husband, Peter. She is also the author of a memoir, a very special memoir to herself, because it is of her grandmother. And it is entitled The Tennis Champion Who Escaped the Nazis. Welcome, Felice.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Do you mind just sharing just a little bit about your history with this book, because it's a memoir of your grandmother, and just share a little bit about her and what inspired you to write this book?
I call it a family memoir because it's not all about me. It started in 2015 when my daughter, who was a student then, said to me, "We don't know anything about the Austrian side of our family. We live in the UK. We know our dad's British, but we don't know anything about one side of our family. Can you tell us about it?" And I said, "Well, I don't know very much." She then said, "Well, I haven't booked, but you could book tickets to go to Vienna. We could go for a long weekend, and then we can go and find out," because that's where my mother came from. She just happened to have her laptop open with cheap flights displayed in front of me. And so I booked 4 flights for myself and my 3 kids. And my husband said he'd stay at home to look after our dogs. And then I booked some accommodation and off we went. The first thing I did, a walking tour when we got there. And so a woman who was bilingual, German and British, she spoke perfect English, took us round on a walking tour. And at the end, that was really interesting in itself. But at the end, she said, "By the way, my hobby is helping people research their ancestors if they came from Vienna. Would you like me to help you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." And so she said, "Well, when you get home again, send me an email with all the names, any details you've got about your family members, and I'll do the rest." So I sent her the names. I didn't know very much. I knew my grandparents. I knew my mother had been born in Vienna. I didn't know where my grandparents had been born. I knew the address of their apartment in Vienna. That's about it. Anyway, about a couple of weeks later, an email came back with so much information. It was amazing. She'd found out, because she'd been into the archives for me, which I couldn't do because I don't speak German. And she had found out all about my grandmother's family, her 2 sisters. I knew she'd had 1 sister. She never mentioned the other one. So 2 sisters, that she had a mother called Felice as well, who I'm named after. That was never mentioned, that she was my great-grandmother had the same name as me. So much information. I then knew where my grandmother had been born, where my grandfather had been born, the actual addresses, names of all their siblings, and it was incredible. Anyway, the researcher woman in Vienna said, "The best thing you should do now is get in touch with the Prague Museum in the Czech Republic, because they will know more," because my grandmother was actually born in what is today the Czech Republic, and my grandfather in Slovakia. So I then got in touch with them, and on it went. I just managed to gather so much information. And then I thought, it's time to go on a little tour of these places and meet some people and find out more. So my husband and I went. And we started in Prague. We went to the village where my grandmother had been born, the village where my grandfather had been born. And it started together. I got so much information. And at first, I thought, well, I'll write this down for my kids and, it'd be a really nice thing for them to have later and then for their children later on. But then I started to write more and more. And I am a writer anyway, although I write about travel, not memoir, usually. I showed it to a couple of friends, this sort of things I'd written down, and they said, "This is amazing. You should write it for more than just your family. You should write it and maybe get it published." And so it grew from there, really. It just got bigger and bigger, and I wrote more and more. I found out more details, because the details they keep in these European countries are incredible. Since I finished my book and it's published, I've tried to research my dad's family. He was British, and it's really, really difficult. There's no information. Whereas in these Eastern European countries and Central European countries, the records are incredible. As long as you've got someone to help you with the language, because I don't speak any of those languages.
That's amazing. You've been a writer your entire life, the travel guidebooks. Did you ever see yourself venturing out from writing travel?
No, I didn't. And actually, I enjoy this much more than writing about travel, because travel writing, it was great. It used to be great. But then a lot of things hit on travel writing, which were not good in Britain. Brexit, that really affected travel, and then followed by COVID, of course. There was no travel at all. So travel writing was dead for a couple of years and not very good, which is when I started my travel podcast, again, together with my husband, because we thought, if we can't go anywhere, let's interview people in other places, people who've been on amazing travels and done sort of interesting things while they're traveling. So that's how we started our travel podcast. But travel writing is quite often, it's more of a list than anything else. It's like the top 10 beaches or the top 10 cities for honeymooners. Just writing a family memoir was much, much interesting, much more fun.
So you had used photos while writing this memoir. Where did you get the photos?
My grandmother had quite a few photo albums. When she came to the UK, to Britain in 1939, she didn't bring anything with her because she was escaping Hitler. So she didn't bring anything, but she'd left quite a lot of her things with a friend in Vienna, and she was able to retrieve them after the war. I have a whole suitcase full of photo albums, which really helped with my research, because when I went to the Czech Republic, to the village where my grandmother was born, more of a town actually than a village these days, I took one of the photo albums with me, which had the pictures of my grandmother's house where she grew up. And that really helped, because I found the house, which was now government buildings. So I wouldn't have been allowed to look around. But when I showed the woman who seemed to be in charge, showed her the pictures in the album, and I had looked up the word for grandmother in Czech, so I knew one word, was able to make her understand that my grandmother had lived there, and she let me look around, which was good.
That is so neat. That is really awesome. When did you start writing the memoir as far as from her life? Like, did you start from her childhood? And then when did you end the memoir as far as like what span of life did you write about?
Well, it's not just my grandmother, it's my grandfather as well. The title of the book is The Tennis Champion Who Escaped the Nazis, because she was tennis champion of Austria in 1930. And then when she came to them, played at Wimbledon, carried on with her tennis. It was the whole of their lives, whole of my grandparents' lives. So they had told me lots of stories about their childhood, and they had very different childhoods. My grandmother came from a wealthy family. Her father owned a distillery that made, I don't know if that's the same thing in American. She had a very nice upbringing. She was one of 3 sisters. They had everything they wanted. She was really good at the piano. She played in concerts, and then she took up tennis in a small way when she was a child, not really seriously till later, till she got to Vienna. My grandfather's background was completely different. He came from a family of 13 children, lived in a tiny little cottage in the mountains. When it was cold, they didn't have heating. They brought one of the cows into the kitchen to keep the house warm. And when it was really, really cold, they brought in 2 cows. So it was a really rural, very poor upbringing. He left school at 15 and went to Vienna to seek his fortune. He had very little education. He was always had lots of ideas, and he was ahead of what he should be doing. He was in fashion and decided to start selling stockings, as they were then, before tights came out. He and his brothers went into business together, and they did well for themselves. And he met my grandmother by chance on a trip to Paris in the Louvre Museum, which is the museum where the Mona Lisa is. They found that they both spoke the same language. My grandmother wasn't at all interested in my grandfather, but he sent her roses, pink roses, which she loved, until she agreed to go out on a date with him, a lunch date. She grew fond of him. He went back to Vienna, carried on keeping in touch with her, and eventually they got married in 1924. They met 100 years ago last month.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So what was one of the most fascinating facts that you found while you were doing your research?
One of the things I found is that my grandmother had 2 sisters. She only ever talked about one. She didn't talk about the other at all, which was really strange. And I think I discovered that she had terrible guilt, survivor's guilt, and a sort of trauma that's passed on. I put a stop to it, I feel, by writing this book. Basically, she and my grandfather and my mother, who was a kid at the time, managed to leave Vienna because they were of Jewish heritage. Although they weren't religious and they didn't practice their religion at all, because of the Nazis, they couldn't stay. They would have been killed. And my grandmother tried to persuade her mother. Her mother was a widow at that stage. This was in the 1930s. And her two sisters to leave as well. But she always felt she didn't try hard enough. And she felt very guilty because they were all killed by the Nazis. And she survived. She managed to come to England and survive. And I think the sister she felt guiltiest about was she had a sister who was disabled, who couldn't walk very well. My grandmother felt she could have helped her more in escaping, and she didn't. So that's one thing I found out. Another, I found out that my grandmother, she qualified to play at Wimbledon tennis tournament in England, in London, which is the biggest championship in the UK. In order to qualify, she had to play 3 other women and beat them. This was in 1939. And one of the women she played was a woman called Susan Billington. And Susan Billington later went on to have 2 grandsons. One of them was called Tim Henman. Now, I don't know if you've heard of him over there, but here he's a very well-known tennis player. And so my grandmother beat Tim Henman's grandmother. So that was fun to know. And when I was doing my research, I went into the archives in the museum in Wimbledon, and they told me that after the Second World War, my grandmother and my mother doubles together at Wimbledon. And they were the only mother and daughter who've ever played doubles together at Wimbledon. And that record will never be broken because my grandmother was in her 40s by then. So it would be unheard of for someone of that age to play tennis in a big tournament. So I always say that Tim Henman's grandmother passed on her tennis talent to her grandsons. She had 2 grandsons. But my grandmother didn't pass on any tennis talent to me. Unfortunately, I'm no good at tennis at all.
Too funny. When you were doing research, from when did you start to begin doing research till the finished product of your book? How long did that span?
Well, the book was published this summer in July, and I started writing notes and researching it in 2015. So probably it took 3 years of research, but I wasn't doing it full time because I had a day job. And so all in all, probably about years, and then another couple of years of actually writing it.
Some of your research was secondhand, basically, because your grandma was telling you the stories. But how did you get the rest? Like, I know you got some records, but where did you go to get these records?
There's a website called geni.com, which is GENI.com, where you can put up your family tree. Other people put on their family trees too, and sometimes they overlap. So you get to meet other people who might be a cousin of a cousin of a cousin. Through that, though, I met a second cousin who lived in California, another one, a man that lived in Vienna, who was a distant relative as well. And they all had little stories about my grandparents that I didn't know, which was amazing. Also, I went to the archives in all these countries. So I went, researched the archives in Vienna, Austria, Prague, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia. There's quite a few really museums in those places, and they were all really helpful. I found the right name of the person there who was in charge of the archives before, and then I emailed them saying I was coming to visit. And they were all really, really helpful. They took me around for the day. Someone took me around my grandmother's town and showed me all the different places she might have been to. People really helpful who've helped me with this story. People I've never met before, but they just wanted to help. They loved history. So that was great.
I never got to meet my grandfather on my dad's side, my biological grandfather on my dad's side. I did have the opportunity one time to go out to lunch with somebody who knew him, and that was interesting. And her first response was, "Do you know about your grandfather?" And I was like, "Yes, I do." And she's like, "Okay, just want to make sure so I'm not like springing on some bad news." But it was just very interesting to be able to hear from somebody because it's stuff I never got to know. When I opened up your book, the first thing I noticed was your story begins with Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass. Why did you decide to start there?
I think I wanted to start with something dramatic to make people read on.
So that people know what is Kristallnacht, because both you and I know, but I want to make sure other people know what Kristallnacht is.
Okay, it was a night in November in 1938. It was the night when the Germans had already come into Austria They'd been welcomed into Austria. They didn't have to invade where people wanted them. The Nazis went around burning everything. All the Jewish-owned shops and businesses, they broke the windows, they burnt the synagogues, they caused chaos. They burnt books written by writers of Jewish heritage. It was chaos. People were taken into prison that night. Some people were killed themselves because they were so scared of what was going to happen next. It was a night of chaos. My grandfather, who was in Vienna when this happened, hiding. When I wrote my book, what I didn't want was for it to be just a history book. I wanted people to get to know the characters. And I've introduced dialogue, which obviously I didn't know the dialogue. I didn't take notes. I wasn't there. I wasn't born. But I've made up dialogue to make the people more human. And I knew my grandparents really well, and my mother. She was a child at the time. I knew the things my grandparents would say. I knew some things they'd really had said as well.
How old was your mom at that time?
She was 11 going on 12, and she was 12 when she arrived in England, not knowing a word of English. She only spoke German. So it was really tough for her, and she had to completely change her life. And after that, she tried to hide it, and she wanted her kids, myself and my sister, to be brought up as typically English girls. No religion, no politics, nothing to do with her past at all. And so that's why I didn't know very much about it. Because of that, I wanted to hide everything.
Did she end up telling you more about it later on in life, or did she keep it a secret?
She kept it a secret. I found out more, as I mentioned, from other family members. I have an aunt who's alive. She's 98. Her brain is good. She remembers things. So I've spoken to her, and another aunt who's younger than that, who's told me a lot too. So I've talked to other family members.
So had your mom already passed away before you started writing this?
Oh, yeah, a long time ago. She died when she was 51. She died before her parents, which is really sad for them because they'd escaped from Nazi-occupied Austria with their only child, and then they lost her. She died young of cancer. So it was really, really sad for them, and for me, of course, but for them till a good old age, but without their daughter. Tried to show their personalities, and my grandfather was a very kind man, very down to earth. He came from this poor background, no education, but he was always really ahead of everything. He bought me my first computer because he used to read all the business pages in the newspapers and magazines. So he knew all about the latest technology, even in his 90s. He was very knowledgeable, very wise. My grandmother, on the other hand, could be quite a tricky lady, used to being the star, having been a tennis star in her country when she was young. My grandfather was very patient with her, I think.
What were some things that you really admired about both of them?
As I said, my grandfather, because he was just really kind, down to earth, lovely man. My grandmother, she was funny. They never learned English well because they came to England as adults. My grandfather, when he learnt his English, when he came here in 1939, he learnt it from a dictionary. So my grandmother always used to joke, he only knows words that begin with the letter A because he never got further than that, which obviously is a joke. But yeah, his English wasn't great. She already knew a bit of English, but she had funny words that she used it used to make me laugh when I was a kid.
So since you knew your grandma and grandpa, what was the biggest challenge writing this, specifically because you knew them?
The challenge was to make sure I was honest about them. I'm not going to make my grandmother into someone she's not. She was quite difficult at times. Yeah, I just wanted to be honest about them and describe them as best as I could for the story. And I hope, people who knew my grandparents, there are people alive today who knew them, and they said that it's pretty accurate about them. So that's good. I feel I've succeeded.
What do you think the biggest takeaway is for your readers?
One thing I've learned, the really major thing I've learned from this, which I talk about because I've been giving quite a lot of talks about my book at literary festivals. The thing I've learned is how important it is to keep people's stories, older people's stories. So if you have parents, grandparents, you must ask all about their childhood. about their time when they were young, because all their stories will be forgotten otherwise. And everybody has an interesting story. They don't have to have escaped from Hitler or something. They could have had some story that seems really boring to them, but it's not. It's not boring. For example, I interviewed a woman in a small village near where I live. Her daughter wanted me to write down about her life. She's a 95-year-old woman. And when I turned up to interview her, the lady said to me, "Oh, my life's been so boring. Why would my daughter want you to write it down?" And then I started interviewing her, and she'd had such an interesting childhood. She'd just grown up in this small village in Dorset, which is a rural county in the UK. She'd grown up during the Second World War, and she told me about what she used to eat, because there was a shortage of food, what she did about clothes. She told me all about dating in the wartime and going to dances, parties. And it was really, really interesting because I didn't know anything about it. So I think all stories are interesting. So I say to younger people, ask the older generation, write it down or record them speaking. And for the older generation as well, to tell their children and grandchildren, because it's so sad if stories get lost.
I had the privilege of my own grandma and grandpa on my mom's side, a lot of questions about their childhood, and that was very fascinating. And I'm so glad that I did that. I have it written down somewhere, and now you have me wanting to find that to see if there's anything that I have forgotten over the years, because I'm sure there is, because it was several pages worth of stuff I wrote. When you wrote this, was there anybody that you pulled from for inspiration as far as authors or books that just really inspired you to help you write this?
No, I read around the subject. So I read lots of books about the Holocaust and World War II, but I didn't want to be influenced by any other book. And also, a lot of the books of that time are quite depressing and sad and horrific. It has got sad parts in it and some things, like the beginning of the book, which is pretty horrific. But I wanted to end it with a note of hope about the future. And I dedicated it to my kids and my niece and nephews, saying, this book is for you because you are the future. Yeah, I wanted it to be a hopeful book about finding myself, because I now know all about my heritage, which I didn't know before, and my kids now do as well. And about being honest about who you are. And I think because of that, you have this survivor's guilt, people who survive a tragedy like a war, an earthquake, a tsunami, or anything like that. The people who are left, who survive, feel enormous guilt because maybe they should have helped other people more. Perhaps they could have saved someone else, a family member or a friend, and they didn't manage to, which is what my grandparents felt. And this feeling of guilt can be passed on down the generations, and it's not good. I think you need to be really open and express yourself and know everything, and then it's better, it's healthier mentally to be yourself and to rid of this sort of feeling of guilt that's been passed down.
That's beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing about this. And I definitely have this on my to be read. I actually started it. I just hadn't finished it yet. Things have been busy this week, but I am definitely going to, especially because this is one of my favorite topics to read about that when it comes through like nonfiction. But I do have a question. It's a question I ask everybody. What is one piece of advice that you would give to a not yet published author, specifically for those that may be wanting to write a memoir, either of their own life or of someone that they love?
Don't give up. That's my advice, because you can start and you think, oh, there's so much to write. How will I ever write? I wrote nearly 90,000 words. And you think, you start and you've written 10,000, you think, oh, I'll never get there. When you have finished, you think, I'll never find a publisher, or I don't know how to self-publish. But there's lots of information out there on the internet. And there are lots of groups who can help you. I mean, I'm a member of several different writers' groups, and I find that really, really useful. It's really encouraging. People will encourage you. So if you feel like writing a book, join your local writers' group, because then you critique each other's writing. Take along something I've written, 1,000 words of something every week, to members of my writers group, and they all take something along as well, and we read it out loud and we critique each other's work, and that's really helpful. So I think the thing is to get advice from other writers and don't give up, because you'll get there in the end. You can self-publish. I did find a publisher, a small publisher, but it was amazing. It took me probably a year to find a publisher. But a friend of mine at the same time, she self-published a book. So it's quite interesting. We're watching each other's progress, because I went with a small publisher. She did it herself. So it's interesting to see the journeys we both took.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. That's great advice. Anyway, again, thank you so much for sharing. And I really look forward to reading this book. I will have a link to it in the show notes for those who would like to read it. And your grandma's name, I don't think we actually ever said it, was Liesel, or can you say the name so I don't remember it?
Liesel Herbst. Herbst means autumn or fall, German. Yeah. And the other thing I should is that I have a blog, which is about my book. And it's my name. It's felicehardy.com. I give talks about the book, not just in the UK, but online as well. More about it and more about future books I write.
Yes, so you are working on something right now.
I am. It's very, very different. I've just been commissioned to write a book about the history of retriever dogs.
Oh, that would be fascinating. My husband would love that. He likes learning the history of dogs. It's so funny. I tried getting him to get a dog for most of our life, and then we got a dog, and I can't stand the thing. He loves it.
Oh, I love them. Well, this is going to be different, because most books about animals, domestic animals, are about the care for your animal. This is going to be about the history. So I'm going to find lots of stories and people to interview who have Labrador Retriever dogs, and find out some interesting things about them, some interesting little stories.
That's the type of stuff my husband likes, like not to care about them. He likes to learn the history behind them, especially finding out, how they were breeded into the type that they are now. Anyway, thank you very much for being on here. Again, I'll make sure I get your blog in the show notes as well as the book itself. Thank you again.
And the book can be bought from Amazon, or you can order it at your local bookstore.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Author's Alcove. We will be back next week on Wednesday, where we will have a writer share yet another piece of work. Also, every other Tuesday, we do learn from experts such as editors, marketing execs, book cover artists, illustrators, and more. If you are interested in being a guest on our show, feel free to go to authorsalcove.com, go to the podcast tab, and then click on Be a Guest. If you're looking for a healed heart, hop on over to our sister podcast, Strength, Love, and Healing with Author's Alcove. You can find that on Spotify and the Apple Podcast. Thank you so much for listening today. Have a great day.